Hello everyone, welcome to Sport Initiative. I'm Antonia Lampi, Sport Initiative's director, and I'm happy not to introduce the evening and the speakers and the momentum. I will leave this honor with Christine. But I'm here to introduce two things that actually precede this evening. So on the one hand, I really actually want to encourage and mention how incredibly grateful and thankful we are to Zeit, Reden and the amazing organizers behind this, Christine, Ido, and Haia. For truly having been put together in the many months since the series has started, one of the most thought-provoking, relevant, and urgent conversations and dialogues to have, not only in Germany right now. And I say it also with some kind of pinch of pride, actually, because the three of them met here at Sport Initiative. They didn't know each other before. And a lot of these ideas actually emerged through ongoing programs that we also do, thanks to so many communities that actually engage here. And something else that I wanted to say is actually a little bit more about Sport Initiative, because I have the feeling that many of you predominantly know this auditorium and the space in front of it, and I wanted to take this opportunity to just say a few things about us, which is that we actually are an entity, a cultural initiative that works in Berlin, in this house, but also internationally in the global majority. We have a lot of long-term collaborations with particularly agroecological initiatives working on food sovereignty, including in the West Bank right now. And that leads me also to invite you to actually visit our exhibitions that opened just a few weeks ago that have been, in fact, brought together through a deep collaboration with a cooperative in the West Bank, which I'm not naming for security reasons, and that really focus on Palestinian life and Palestinian experience, on what I like to call the quiet radicalism of tending to life in the context of this ongoing genocide. And I think it's really important to also be able to pause and listen to stories that are actually happening on land, with food, with growing seeds, and that happen despite it all. We have a lot of other things. We have a library on the second floor. We work with small publishers from all over the world. We have a library with a lot of different languages, from Arabic to Farsi to Creole to French and whatnot. So I invite you to go. We have a garden outdoors with a community kitchen, so we actually work a lot also on methodologies of growing food, seeds in contexts of water scarcity. We experiment on methods of soil remediation, and we do so between groups that we work with in Germany as well as internationally. So please stay connected and visit more than what you see right now. We also have an Armenian cafe, Cafe Arakil. I really invite you also to be with them. They do a lot of cultural programs as much as offer pastry sandwiches and of course the drinks you probably will have tonight. I want to equally mention important practical infos. Accessible bathrooms are downstairs and they're accessible also via an elevator. Our host team is around and happy to help, and you will recognize them through a blue keychain. And especially for tonight, we have an awareness team in place. You see them, please raise your hand with a yellow jacket. So please, if you need emotional support or a quiet moment, reach out to them. Another topic I do want to mention is shared responsibility. We believe in collective care. This space belongs to all of us, not just us organizing, but also you using it. And so we ask everyone to show up with respect for one another, for the work being shared, and for the space itself. And here I want to also ask you, please be kind with our staff. We have experienced very often people being quite aggressive with some of our team members because they're not finding a spot or because not enough people can sit on the stairs. Please understand that we need to be complying with regulations here. So we need to be super careful in what we do and how we do it. And that is absolutely fundamental for being able to do work just like what we're doing this evening. We have a code of conduct that is really important for us, and is grounded in accountability, dignity, and relational ethics. Please take a moment to read it. It's on our website under value paper. Obviously, stay connected. We have a newsletter, an Instagram account. Please follow it. And yeah, that's it for me. Please, a warm welcome again to our speakers tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Antonia. Thanks for having us from the very beginning. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody here inside, everybody outside in front of the screens. Welcome, everybody at home following us on our Instagram. Welcome to our first Zeit zu Reden Spezial, the English edition of Zeit zu Reden, which invites critical voices from abroad to inspire and to advance the discourse in Germany. So let me explain this a little bit. When we started, me and Ido Arad and Heiko Kassian, when we started Zeit zu Reden last September, it was very important for us to do this in German, because we wanted to reach the German mainstream with critical and in-depth discussions. And we wanted to prove to the German public that you can discuss Israel and Palestine, you can discuss antisemitism, anti-Muslim racism, German media, police violence, genocide, apartheid, international humanitarian law. You can discuss this objectively based on facts and expertise in Germany. And we've had 7 panels so far, and each of these panels has made it clear that the public discourse in Germany is disconnected from what is being discussed on an international level. Because we were always arguing, quoting experts from other countries, making our arguments. So we decided to bring these critical voices, scholars, intellectuals, authors, to Germany so they can contribute their thoughts and ideas to the German public debate. At the same time, we decided to offer students and professors a space where they can build knowledge and exchange opinions in closed workshops outside their universities sometimes. So that's exactly what we are doing this month for the first time, the month of May, with the topic of memory culture. The closed workshop already took place yesterday with very smart students and tough discussions, I was told. Now there are 2 panels on the culture of remembrance. The first is today in English. Next week, we will bring the conclusions and the arguments from today's discussion to a German panel to explore a more pluralistic culture of remembrance in Germany. And there couldn't be a better start to this project, obviously, than having Pankaj Mishra on our panel tonight, along with Daniel Mavitzky, and I'll introduce them in a moment, but I want to reflect with you on the past week. It was a very painful week in many ways, because it was full of remembrance, celebration, mourning, atrocities. We commemorated the end of World War II 80 years ago. We commemorated the Nakba 77 years ago. We celebrated 60 years of German-Israeli diplomatic relations. We witnessed 19 months of Israeli military operation in Gaza. We mourned the 103 years old Margot Friedländer, one of the last Holocaust survivors in Germany, who passed away last Friday. And today is the Roma Resistance Day, in remembrance of resistance and solidarity that saved some of them in Auschwitz. So, a painful week with many parallel and contradictory events. On Sunday, the new German Foreign Minister Wadephul met with Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu, praising the excellent relations between the 2 countries, while Gaza remains under siege, under Israeli siege, which means no food, no water, no fuel, no medicine for the Palestinians in Gaza. The German foreign minister fell for Netanyahu's narrative or propaganda and officially supported the plan that would turn humanitarian aid into a weapon of war. Then on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we had the two presidents of the countries, President Herzog and German President Steinmeier, that were celebrating their long friendship. They were describing the relationship between Israel and Germany as a miracle that gives hope for reconciliation with the Palestinians. They both emphasized the importance to release the hostages. They said they were very dear to their minds and hearts. And at the same time, Israel intensified its attacks on Gaza, making it very clear that the hostages were not the top priority of this current government. They declare very openly what they are up to: occupation, annexation, building settlements, and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian population in Gaza. And yes, there were some critical remarks by German representatives, by the foreign minister, by President Steinmeier, but nothing that could stop Israel from starving and killing the people in Gaza right now. And Steinmeier was there when Israel bombed 2 hospitals in Khan Yunis. He was still there when more than 80 Palestinians were killed on Wednesday, including 22 children. And yesterday, Israel, this is all in 1 week, yesterday Israel ordered the evacuation of more parts of Gaza City, forcibly displacing thousands of civilians, and to watch them being displaced and marching reminds us of the Nakba that we commemorated yesterday, 77 years ago, while in Berlin, demonstrators who were trying to commemorate the Nakba were banned from marching and faced brutal police violence. And also yesterday, the political elite of Germany stood at Margot Friedländer's coffin, looking at her picture, reading her famous saying, Zeit, Menschen, be humans, behave like human beings. So they look at Margot Friedländer's call for humanity. They see the crimes against humanity going on in Gaza, and yet they remain silent. Which means that these politicians right now, from the perspective of the victims of the Holocaust, from the perspective of the Palestinians, and from the perspective of international law, they are choosing complicity. So tonight, what we want to do is we want to understand how this denial of reality works. And why is it so widespread in Germany? And our 2 guests here will help us figure that out. Pankaj Mishra is a writer, an essayist, a novelist. He writes for the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, The Guardian, The New Yorker. He was born in northern India in 1969. He studied economics and English literature in New Delhi, and he lives in London now. He has written several best-selling and award-winning books, including From the Ruins of Empire, which became the first book by a non-Western writer to win the Leipzig Book Award for European Understanding back in 2014 already. His most recent book is The World After Gaza, which is widely discussed right now. And he was once described as an important voice in the global south, but in fact he has long since become a leading universal intellectual voice, I would argue. Welcome, Pankaj Mishra. Thanks for being here. The discussion about Gaza, Israel, and Germany requires an expert on the special historical relationship between Israel and Germany. And this is why we've invited Daniel Mavitzky today. Daniel Mavitzky was born in Bremen in 1987. He's a political scientist and teaches international relations at the University of Hong Kong. So another outside perspective from that point of view. Yes, inside, outside. He writes for Le Monde Diplomatique, the Taz, Unheard, Jacobin, the Berlin Review of Books, and others. And he wrote a book that is now being discussed in Germany, although it was already published in English 5 years ago under the title Germany and Israel, Whitewashing and State Building. It was published in German last year under the title Absolution, Israel und die deutsche Staatsräson. Welcome, Daniel Mavitzky. So the idea is to listen to an international perception of what is going on in Germany. Pankaj, you are worried about Germany. But before we talk about what exactly worries you, I would like to understand why would people all over the world care about Germany anyway? You know, why should people in India and China and Russia and Canada and Brazil care about Germany?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Oh, it's coming. Thank you, Christine, and really thank you to all the organizers for hosting this event. Only my second in Germany after this book came out. And really, I'm looking forward to, obviously, the next couple of hours. But I must say that this is an incredibly also emotional event for me to be able to finally speak frankly about this extraordinary assault on all our minds and souls over the last few months. It's a double assault. One is, of course, the assault by a terroristic ruling class in Israel, which kills on a regular basis dozens of people every day, openly, proudly proclaims its genocidal intentions. There is that kind of atrocity. The other kind of atrocity, which has become almost as oppressive, is the moral and intellectual atrocity of the German political and media class, which continues to justify atrocity on this scale, continues to extend unlimited license to the state of Israel to commit these massacres on a daily basis. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to discuss how we came to this miserable moment. And I'm really also very pleased to have Daniel, whose book for me was really an eye-opening experience, made me question, re-examine many of my ideas and assumptions, like very few books have. And so really, I would urge you very strongly, if you haven't read it, to read it to get really what is, I think, the truest picture of this diabolical relationship between Germany and the State of Israel. Christine, I think, you asked me this question about why we should be interested in Germany. Well, I think, I can say very clearly that if you grow up in India, you are very much a part of German history. Why is that? The people who run India today are people who were explicitly inspired by Nazism. They quoted Adolf Hitler in their opening sort of manifestos in the 1930s. Adolf Hitler remains a hugely popular figure in India today. His books are on the bestseller charts permanently, prominently displayed in most of the bookshops in the country. Even if politicians are tactful enough today to not quote him in their speeches, the sentiments they express are very much the sentiments that the Nazis would have heartily approved of, about ethnic purity, about racial purity, about a sort of national community that can be extremely violent, exterminatory towards its internal and external enemies. So this kind of rhetoric has been profoundly internalized by many Indian politicians, Indian journalists today. We saw some evidence of that just last week during this confrontation between India and Pakistan. So what I'm trying to say is that German history concerns all of us, especially now when it's in a way repeating itself, not obviously in precisely the same way, but perhaps in a more disturbing and sinister fashion. So you say, why am I worried about Germany? I'm worried about Germany very, very, very clearly. I can say it's because you have a far-right formation in this country, neo-Nazi, surging and profiting from economic decline, which the current ruling classes are powerless to do anything about. The current ruling classes are borrowing the tricks of the far right. And of course, the political and media class is profoundly invested in what Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister, called a genocidal state just the other day. You have antisemitism out of control. You have islamophobia as well, out of control. And then on top of that, Germany has decided to rearm. If we are not going to be worried by these factors, then I think we have grown extraordinarily complacent. Perhaps we are suffering from brain death of some kind, or some sort of historical amnesia.
I want to go back to this popularity of Adolf Hitler in other parts of the world. Is this because people don't know what Nazism is all about and what it led to? They are not educated about the Holocaust, for example. How much does this play a role in Indian education?
Christine, I'll give you another example to answer your question in a slightly roundabout way. The very same people who deeply admire Hitler and the Nazis are also the same people. I know because I grew up with them, and now they number in the millions. The same people are also great admirers of Zionism. These are people who think Netanyahu is wonderful. So the biggest fan base for Netanyahu and this terrorist ruling class of Israel is in India today. You only have to log into your social media accounts to verify the truth of what I've just said. And why is it that? Why is it that they admire Zionism and Nazism? Because they see in both of them this wonderfully realized hyper-masculinist desire to crush your enemies, especially Muslims. This is something that when I was growing up in India, that was the main source of attraction towards Zionism, which is that the Zionists know how to deal with Muslims in the only language they understand, which is force and more force. So when we talk about the Holocaust, obviously we were not informed about the Holocaust. We were not educated. We didn't know. I had to learn about that myself. But even if we had been told about the Holocaust, you see, they might have tried to justify it by saying this is how you deal with your enemies. This is how you deal with people who undermine the nation state, your proud nation state.
We'll get back to this idea of nationalism and where it comes from and where it leads. But let's take a step back maybe, because the reason for this state that Germany is in from your perspective, from this international perspective, can be summarized somehow with the word of Staatsräson, which has become somehow a synonym for a policy that supports quite everything that Israel does. At least it does not put any conditions to it. So let's talk about this German-Israeli relationship. They have just celebrated 60 years of diplomatic relations. Daniel, you were definitely closely following probably these state visits. What went through your mind when you were watching the presidents and everybody else?
To be very honest with you, I've somewhat stopped following German politicians too closely, just for mental health reasons. Yes, no, honestly, I need to.
This doesn't make them disappear, though. So
I know.
Watch.
So intellectually, academically, I think I can understand it. Emotionally, it's become very difficult to understand it. These state visits create, to put it very politely, an extreme cognitive dissonance in my mind between an image of reconciliation, handshakes, friendship, and the real-time televised, streamed destruction of Gaza, right? So how do you deal with this cognitive dissonance? Either you buy into the official German narrative, then it probably works, or you retreat from it, or you try to understand it, right? Which is what I've tried to do. And I think, this warrants a long discussion, but we can start by criticizing those terms reconciliation and friendship, which are very ideological terms. If you think about it, it shouldn't be upon the successor to the perpetrator nation to talk about reconciliation and friendship and these terms, right? This doesn't work. So why does it work? Because Germany bought itself the right to speak this way about this relationship. How did it do that? And this is what I try to show, is by supporting Israel militarily, financially, diplomatically, industrially, especially up until 1967. Right? So you have to find the root of this relationship in this exchange between whitewashing and state building, as I call it, that really starts in the first post-war decades. And I think forms a prism through which you can understand the relationship until today. Right? So, but still, there's something very strange about it right now, because there's so many other things that the German state could do. Right? You don't have to go all into the destruction of Gaza. There are other policy options that could have been chosen whilst still showing a basic solidarity with the Jewish state.
What would you suggest?
Calling for a ceasefire, stopping weapon deliveries, going after the perpetrators, yes, but not going after the whole of the Gaza Strip, right? And why was this never discussed? Why was this not debated? Why go all in? Up until a point where, as I said yesterday, it's very hard to retreat, right? To admit failure now, to say, okay, what we supported is deeply wrong. To do that now would be, to lose face.
Now, what is important, if we look at the history, is that while Germany was paying a lot of money to the state of Israel, it was not compensating the Jewish victims in the way it should have done so. And our colleague Stefanie Schüler-Springorum just wrote a book about this entitled Unerwünscht, about how shamefully Germany treated the European Jewish victims after the Holocaust. So this is another aspect of it. So we kind of focused everything on supporting the state of Israel instead of really looking at the victims and instead of denazification, right? This was maybe one aspect of it, because there were still people in responsible higher positions right after the Holocaust.
Yes, so you're touching on a lot of issues there. What Germany did was to help build the Israeli state, especially until 1967, when it was consolidated in the region. Right? It's only after that that the US takes over as the primary backer. So this is a very important bit of Cold War history that has to be understood to understand this relationship. This happened, of course, whilst denazification was failing and was aborted. Right? And the reason for that is that, well, helping to build the Jewish state helped to create absolution for Germany. It helped by that handshake, that you could see on TV last week. This is what Germany got from this relationship. So it's an exchange between material state building for Israel, which needed that industrial aid, that money, those weapons, desperately, and symbolic state building for Germany. And it still draws from it, right? And this is to be understood, I think, as well, it has to be made very clear, is that Israelis did not want to solve Germany. There was no talk of reconciliation in Israel, right? The reconciliation bit, that's German, up until today, okay? But what Israel needed was everything to build the state, and this is what Germany provided. And this is a history that in Germany, I would argue, we don't talk about enough, because by creating this history, we have given ourselves the right to speak about friendship, reconciliation, all of that. So I think it's very difficult to look at, very important to look at the material exchange that lies behind the rhetoric, right? And this also then dissolves the cognitive dissonance to some extent.
Then at the same time, Germany was kind of buying a ticket back into the international community, or in the Western community, especially at that time. So when you argue in your book that, this was all about, getting this absolution by Israel to be a respected a member of the Western states of the Western world, isn't Germany risking this position right now? Losing this reputation that it was so busy with and the credibility by supporting Israel in this unconditional way? Why would Germany do this? This is all against its own interests. Yeah. You start first and then finish.
I find it interesting that German memory politics is going so overboard at a moment in which the world is becoming a lot less Western, right? And Germany is losing its reputation, obviously. And there's now studies on that. There's a measurable impact this has on populations, especially in the Middle East and elsewhere. I think what you have to understand is that this wasn't primarily about reputation, but about reputation to regain state power. that's behind it. So every step in German memory politics is ultimately a step towards an increase in state power. And if you take that lens, everything looks even scarier, to be honest, because what happens now is what you said in the beginning, state power is increasing by becoming unfettered from constraints of international law, for example. Ethno-nationalism is rising, and we are rearming. So it's a perfect, mix, if you will. Yeah. But I think this is important.
I think I would also sort of broaden it. I would say two things. One is the German model obviously also worked for other countries in Europe. So very belatedly, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the countries that had treated their own Jewish populations almost as badly as the Germans treated their Jewish population, Poland, Romania, many others, they also found that their entry ticket to respectable society was adopting all these definitions of IHRA and of anti-Semitism, and making these moral claims that finally we recognize the gross injustice, the gross violence we inflicted on the Jewish population, and commit ourselves to these definitions, and of course, eternal solidarity with the State of Israel. So that happened then obviously, across Europe. I would say one more thing, which is that the proximity to the State of Israel, which became codified with Stas Razon and others, you also see this in the case of the United States, in the case of the United Kingdom. Both those countries started to grow closer to Israel after the War on Terror, which, of course, Israel claimed very explicitly and successfully as its own war. This is a war against Islamic barbarism, in which we are really at the vanguard. Netanyahu said things like, he actually said that he was pleased about 9/11. He had to withdraw his statement because he was attacked, or said something to the effect, something really incredibly tactless, but very revealing, because he saw this is a moment where Israel could be repositioned after all the attempts, the peace talks and Oslo, where Israel could start yet again pursuing its old ends, which is occupation and annexation of the West Bank and Gaza. And so that positioning obviously welcomed by people who were part of the ruling class in the United States and the United Kingdom. So you see these governments coming more closer and closer. At the same time, it's as you say, this is a step towards accumulation of greater state power and a decisive step towards authoritarianism, which is what we're seeing today. Closer and closer to it, where it's now, center-left parties are indistinguishable from far-right parties.
As you're mentioning the war on terror, this concept was just something that every ruler in this world could take as an excuse to go after his own personal or internal enemies. This was
including in India,
including in the Middle East. Everybody was having this war on terror, and then the two prime ministers would stand there talking about terrorism. Everybody has anything else, something different in mind. But so this idea of Israel being a country that is defending Western values and democracy against some madmen and Islamic barbars goes along with this idea of being constantly under threat by its neighbors. This is the vision of Israel that we are brought up with in Germany. But I would like to go back to this idea, why does Germany have this same vision of Israel as it is promoted by the government of Israel? Because I think it has to do with identity. We have to go back to this German identity thing. Daniel, you are quoting German President Joachim Gauck, who said that there is no German identity without Auschwitz. So Germany is placing the Holocaust and its commitment to Israel at the center of this collective identity. But what is wrong with this? Is it not normal that a country looks at its history and draws conclusions?
I think there's something actually very good about this. Compared to any other nation, do you know, what other countries do you know that place their own historical sins into the center of the memory politics? Britain doesn't do that. France doesn't do that. The US, a little bit, but also not really, with slavery and colonialism. So, first of all, I think it's a progressive step. And you have to remember that memory of the Holocaust was repressed in Germany for a very long time. And it only really came into the public sphere in the late 70s and then 80s, right? So, first of all, we can see the progressiveness in this, and I think also, Pankaj, you alluded to this in your disappointment, with Germany, because you grew up with this positive image of German memory culture, right? Or this is what you were used to. So, there is something to be applauded. The question is, where did it move from there, and why? And what we see is an extreme decomplexification or simplification of this whole criminal complex of Nazism to its central crime, the Shoah, and then the Shoah is reduced to its ideological feature, which is anti-Semitism, right? So it's been compromised, made smaller, right? And now you can, thank you. Sorry, I'm now used again to speaking German, so I'm switching back to and now you can do a weird little trick. What you can do, from the German state perspective, is to just attribute this anti-Semitism to other groups. For example, the whole population of Gaza. Not just Hamas, but the whole population of Gaza, right? And suddenly, it becomes almost just and fair to bomb the Gaza Strip until it becomes Hiroshima. And then you can frame it as an act of legitimate self-defense and even as an outcome of German memory politics, right? So I think we have to look at, at the very complex ways in which German memory culture progresses and then regresses in tune with German nationalism, which ultimately has to do with, again, the increase in German state power.
Pankaj, you were kind of impressed by German memory culture when you were younger. You are saying this, you're writing this in your book as well. Now the disappointment is quite big. What do you see as the main failures of this memory culture? Is it the lessons that Germany draws from that path, that never again, and how it's interpreted? Or I think you are quite critical about this taking history as the basis for one's own identity. Can you explain that?
I didn't start off that way, but I have become more critical of memory cultures in general. Because I think if you grow up in India and then if you spend some time in places like the United Kingdom, you become extremely aware of how deluded people, very sophisticated, educated people in the UK are about their own imperial past. And how, the BBC or the newspapers, the people who are, dominating intellectual cultures or journalistic culture, they are still able to say criminally stupid things like how the British Empire was a wonderful thing. And when you listen to all this about an empire that caused genocidal famines around the world, not just in Ireland, but different parts of the world, India several times, Mike Davis has written a whole book about the late Victorian Holocaust, you think, what is going on here? When you come from that kind of background, France, of course, is bad in a different way. Some might say much worse in failing to reckon with its imperial past. Then you come to Germany and you think, oh my goodness, this is extraordinary. This is one European country that has had the moral courage to face up to its criminal past, to learn some lessons from it. And obviously, what I was reading and what I was learning also came from sources who were idealizing this whole memory culture. Including, my host last evening, Susan Neiman, who wrote a whole book, Learning from the Germans, which I actually reviewed favorably when it came out. I thought, and she's now changed her mind. She thinks the whole memory culture has gone completely crazy. And crazy in what way? I was saying to her yesterday, let's think about the British, embracing this memory culture. Okay, they embrace it, but then they decide, of all the people they killed in different parts of the world, the only people they will now be morally responsible to would be India under an extremist regime that worships Adolf Hitler. They will support them regardless of what that government does. They will not support anyone else. They will not pay reparations to any of the other peoples who they were responsible for killing, but chose to give India endless license to kill, to commit genocide. What kind of memory culture would this be? This is what I mean by these extreme distortions in a memory culture which starts with, or at least claims to be, a genuine moral reckoning, but then degenerates into this kind of institutional, cynical realpolitik. And of course, you know, the sort of accumulation of authoritarian power by a state, using that memory culture to become, you know, essentially more and more intolerant against dissenters, against anyone who challenges the state's orthodoxies.
So let's talk about the concrete lessons that the Germans draw from this memory culture, which is this big never again. And after Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, which resulted in horrific atrocities that constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity, this lesson never again has become a moral imperative, you know, a call to action by adding never again is now. Now, never again is now. To whom does this apply? You know, how are we applying this, and what's wrong with that?
Well, that's what I mean. That's why I use the British example. Is that if you're only thinking,
Yeah, but what's the alternative? Let's put it positively.
Yeah. The alternative is, of course, yes, you have to be protective of the state of Israel, which is created in response to this monstrosity you were partly or largely responsible for. And then, you know, obviously also because nobody else was willing to accept the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, all the major countries that actually won the war and now claim to have liberated the camps and so on, these were people who were raising up their barriers to the Jewish population. So the creation of Israel became a moral necessity. Now, if you want to make a straightforward moral claim, a claim that you owe a debt to this new state, we need to defend it. I've seen absolutely no problem with that. But how do you defend it? Do you defend it by giving Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir the license to kill Palestinians by the thousands every day?
They are the democratically elected politicians in Israel. That's the
democracy doesn't license genocide. You know, I think just because you have elections every 4 years or 3 years doesn't mean that the ruling class has license to do whatever it wants. And we know how profoundly defective and flawed Israeli democracy is. Israelis themselves have been protesting against the undermining of this democracy by the people who are running it. So if you have any sense, if you can see clearly what is going on in Israel, are you really defending the state of Israel? You're actually condemning it to endless war and endless civil war in this instance.
And I mean, the main lesson from the Holocaust should be probably, Daniel, to strengthen international humanitarian law, because this was one of the big lessons after the Second World War, to build up this international humanitarian law. And what is interesting about this is that everybody in Germany is defending this. You know, rhetorically, the German politicians, they are talking about human rights, they are talking about international human rights law, humanitarian law. Why supporting these military actions? And what is very interesting is, you know, we have a lot of Germans who take to the streets against the AfD. You know, the AfD, they say, no, you know, we don't want these right-wing extremists, we are against nationalism. We have big demonstrations, we had big demonstrations against these enemies of democracy. And then somebody comes up and holds a poster saying, stop the genocide in Gaza, in the same demonstration, or free Palestine. And the Germans would say, no, this is today, it's not about Palestine. Today is not about Gaza, today it's about Germany. It's about our democracy. So we really have to make this connection somehow, right? I mean, how do we convince people that defending Palestinians is necessary if you want to save German democracy? There is this connection. So how do we explain this to the people?
If I may say something about this question of drawing lessons. There are obviously lessons to be drawn. One is international law, but I don't think you need to, in a sense, find meaning in what was essentially a meaningless genocide, which was the Holocaust, right? And you don't need to, in a way, abuse the memory of the victims by saying, oh, now Israel should or should not do this, right? I don't even think you need to go into that history to say what is happening in Gaza is wrong and it shouldn't be supported, right? So in a way, I'm almost against this big drawing of lessons from a really unspeakable history of Germany, because I think as human beings, you don't need to support this, right? And I want to say something about the German reaction as well. When October 7th happened, I was, from a German perspective, deeply shocked, you know? I saw this through a very German mindset as a pogrom, right? And not as a vicious anti-colonial attack, right? I want to make that clear. So I was also caught up for a while, almost in Staatsräson, right? And then I realized what was happening in Gaza fairly quickly, I think, you know, at least a bit quicker than other Germans. Yeah, I know, that's why it's not a compliment to myself. But again, what strikes me is there is the extremeness of the reaction, that you support this government that uttered its intent of destroying Gaza and its population many times. There's no secret about this, right? And yet, still, we as a country, as a state, have been supporting this, right? And why? As I said, there would have been many other ways of showing solidarity without going to that end where there's now almost no getting out of.
So let's make this connection between the government of Israel being a nationalist, right-wing, ethno-nationalist government, and ask ourselves, maybe Pankaj, you can talk about this, who are the allies of Israel right now? You have already hinted to some of them. And which states are the ones that are kind of on the side of the Palestinian people? And this alliance between far-right nationalists and the Israeli government, what is it built on? And or maybe let's start with this question: what drives nationalism in the first place? Because you started to talk about this, talking about India. So what is it that drives nationalism everywhere?
Well, I think obviously at different times, nationalism has been driven by a diverse set of motivations. You know, when India was fighting for its independence against British Empire, it was driven by a desire for dignity and freedom from the white man's world, from systematic racism, for sovereignty. Then, of course, the post-colonial state comes into being, and it turns out that nation-states are extremely bloody, violent affairs. And so that nation-state starts suppressing its own minorities. Nationalism starts to become toxic. Now, this is a process that is not unique to Israel, India. You can observe it around the world, in large parts of Asia and Africa, that nation-states created with the best of intentions, as you know, a release, a redemption from victimhood, soon become oppressors themselves. Now, again, today what we are looking at a group of people around the world who belong to what I might call, in the age of globalization, a truly global ruling class. You know, people with interests in different parts of the world, not confined to their own national territory, but really benefiting from this sort of global networks of wealth and power. And they all know that in order to face, you know, the challenges we face today, whether it's artificial intelligence or climate change, we need different institutions. Institutions of nation states are not sufficient anymore. But they don't care about these things. What they care about is perpetuating the wealth and power they've accumulated. And so they will use nationalism to, in a way, and you know, a really toxic far-right version of nationalism, to hold on to their power, to keep the masses, to keep the electorates in a state of delusion for as long as possible, and you know, really, in a way, just continue to keep doing this. Now, I think in the case of Israel, what Israel has done, and this is something that should disturb us all, it has staked its future on this state of affairs. It's staked its future on a global lawless class of people. So it's not only Trump. It's not you know, only the far right in Europe, or the Christian evangelists in India. It's also in America, but it's also people like the Indian Prime Minister. These are, you asked me that question about who are Israel's allies, and when you look at Israel's allies, it becomes clear they're all doing this to remain on top of the game wherever they are. They're all coming together in this, fashion, perpetuating, lawlessness, perpetuating a kind of organized loot of the world's resources. So, to sort of rephrase Marx, it's like plutocrats of the world unite. You've got nothing to lose but your inhibitions about killing a lot of people. And that is what you look at Trump's tour in the Middle East last week. You look at the deals he's making. You look at the Indian businessmen going to meet him in Dubai. We have to really start focusing on this and start to move away from abstract discussions of, how does nationalism go toxic? Because what we're looking at is really, in a way, a sort of end game where the older institutional structures are no longer functioning. They are no longer able to perform their political functions in the age of globalization, by which I mean too much loss of sovereignty by the nation state, too much power given to transnational networks of capital. And you are very much one of these people who are talking about nationalism are very much part of those global transnational networks. And yet, nationalism is their ticket, remains their ticket to power.
What does it have to do with racism? Because, you are talking about Trump. He is a white supremacist, basically, in the White House. We have Jewish supremacists in the Israeli government. Europe is full of these strong men and strong women, Viktor Orban, Geert Wilders, Matteo Salvini, Marine Le Pen. So isn't this maybe already, has this post-colonial world order maybe transformed into a pre-colonial or even now colonial one right now? Are we moving backward with this new ethno-nationalism, or are we moving forward into something worse?
Well, I think that's very important because, in many ways, what Trump or what Netanyahu are proposing is a social Darwinist world of the late 19th century, where you grab territory, resources, wherever you can. So Israel, it's stealing Syrian territory as we speak, it's stealing Lebanese territory as we speak, it's resettling Gaza, it's annexing West Bank. Trump has threatened to annex land in 3 different continents. So what we are really looking at in many ways, a kind of return to a rapacious 19th century mode of nation-state, imperial state expansion. And that is what is really fueling so much of these energies. And what role does racism play? Racism, so many of these kind of ideologies, what it is doing is defining the people who are superfluous, who have to be, if not exterminated, completely marginalized, made powerless, rendered impotent. That is the traditional role that racism has performed in the modern era, to identify people whose labor, if necessary, should be, of course, stolen, should be extracted, but often, in many cases, if it's increasingly unproductive labor, and if you're looking at finance here, then a lot of these people are just simply superfluous, and they should be exterminated. But how do you do that? You have to first dehumanize them. You have to first say these are anti-Semites, and therefore we need to exterminate the population of Gaza. There are ways in which you have to depict them as less than human animals, as the Israeli defense minister put it in the early days of October 2023.
Now in Germany we thought this would not happen to us, nationalism, because we already got over it. For a certain time we were like the last European countries who had a right-wing party winning elections, so we kind of had a lot of hope that this would not return. Now what we see now is that even we are faced with this growing right-wing party. And there is an interesting argument that you make. You are saying that some Germans may project their nationalism onto Israel as a proxy state because of this taboo of being too nationalist in Germany. They celebrate and applaud Zionism, And I want to ask you, Daniel, is there an historical continuity here again? Because in your book you're writing about the 1960s and about this projection, because politicians and journalists described Israeli young men, for example, at that time as strong, tall, and blue-eyed. You have some headlines, you're quoting some headlines from where people were making comparisons to Germany's Nazi past. You know, Blitzkrieg and these things. So is there an historical continuity for this claim that Germans would project their own nationalism onto Israel?
Yeah. I will answer that question. Just first to come back to something you said, I think I would agree with your general depiction of the function of racism, but when it comes to the Israel-Palestine issue at the moment in Gaza, wouldn't you say that the role of racism comes out of a very deep anxiety, also on both sides, of being pushed out of the land, of being killed, and that this is not more a function of a truly eliminationist conflict over land and identity in that specific context?
I would agree with that.
Yeah? Okay, so I was wondering, because on a general level, I think you're worryingly right. But yeah, I wanted to ask about that. And then projection of nationalism. Yes, I mean, going into the archives and studying German-Israel relations was truly eye-opening. And if anybody wants to do a PhD, I don't encourage that, but if you do, there's a lot more to be found, because it's an extremely important relationship for the reconstruction of the German state, really. And you find a lot of weird stuff. So one example that you're alluding to is the German observer delegation at the Eichmann trial. And this delegation concluded that everything went well. Israel differentiated between the old Germany of the Nazis and the new Germany of today. Mind you, Hans Globke, who helped draft the Nuremberg laws, he was Adenauer's Secretary of State, right? So this differentiation between old and new was very blurry. But they were happy with that. And then they concluded their report by complimenting the, I quote, new type of very advantageous Israeli youth, blonde, blue-eyed, end of quote, I forgot the rest, basically a self-imagination of Germans, right? They were basically saying, look, they look like Prussians, right? The ideal type of German. And you find quite a bit...
And like Rommel.
Yeah, exactly. So it's amazing to look into the reactions during the 1967 war that Israel won in 6 days, also due to German help. And to read German newspapers like Der Spiegel or Bild that were complimenting Moshe Dayan as Erwin Rommel, right? Or that were complimenting the Blitzkrieg that Israel so successfully won with German tanks, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of projection there, which of course then East Germany used for its propaganda against West Germany, right? So it's a whole fascinating...
so Israel was this small, brave, heroic
they were
nation.
what the Germans wanted to be. So it's really... you can see how German nationalism is reconstructed also on this example of this projection. Right? And this projection, I think, you have going on until today, and projection also helps, it's in the word Staatsräson already, right? Like, we can talk about that. This projection helps to explain this totally bizarre one-sided empathy that Germany has. Can you even have one-sided empathy? Isn't that something that you should have for, all sides? But if you understand that when Germans talk about Israel, they're actually talking about themselves, then a lot of these debates suddenly make sense. Right? And then you have to differentiate between German debates, which are about Germany, and what is happening in the Middle East. And these are two different things.
It's a kind of malignant narcissism, which is turned genocidal. But I would say that this part of your book actually spoke to me very directly. This projection, because I grew up with people in India who were projecting their own latent nationalism onto Israel. And that was a kind of taboo nationalism in India at that time. To give you some context, I grew up in a country where secularism was an official creed. And any assertion of ethnic, racial, religious identity was disapproved of, frowned upon, in some cases criminalized. We used to have a word for it, it's still in operation, called communalism. This was something that was to stay away from. So any kind of community built around these kinds of affiliations. So Hindu nationalism was in that sense a sort of taboo nationalism when I was growing up. But it had this subterranean secret existence which was fed by this identification with Israel. Look, these guys are able to get away with it. What we would like to get away with it. And I would argue that the attraction that the far right across Europe and America today has to Israel is based on the same set of emotional and ideological identification with Israel. Like, these people can do what we would really love to do, because for them, secular liberalism, social liberalism is sort of holding them back from being true men and really beating up their enemies in the way they would really like to. That is the role Israel plays in the political imaginary in Europe and the United States today.
And to be able to do that or to think like this, you have to, as you said before, dehumanize the other. You have to oppress and marginalize the other, and using or looking always for scapegoats. You know, this is the idea of scapegoats, which are primarily right now Palestinians and Muslims in Europe. I mean, Arabs and migrants maybe in general. And this racism, I just want to mention this, is not about feelings. You know, you don't feel somehow oppressed. It's about facts. And this week we just saw the first database on anti-Palestinian repression in Germany that was published by the European Legal Support Center, and that revealed that repression against Palestinians is systematic, institutional, and undeniable in Germany. This is important to stress. So this, again, is this a new phenomenon, or is this already familiar from the past, Daniel? Because you are stressing in your book that for Germany to be able to stand with Israel in this unquestionable way, Israel always has to be the perfect victim, you know. So in order to be the perfect for Israel to be the perfect victim, the eternal victim, you have to ignore the Palestinians altogether, right? So is there this continuity again between, you know, this nowadays anti-Palestinian racism and maybe the fact that we had to ignore the Palestinian cause to be able to align ourseldes in this way to Israel?
Yes, I think the whitewashing state-building logic means that Germany is able, and also depends on the creation of a certain ideal type of Israel in the Middle East, right? So that's one thing. And that means, being very selective about what you choose to look at in the Middle East. Put it this way. But the anti-Palestinian bit, I think now in this current very repressive form, because this is new, I think the repression has intensified to some extent. This comes out of Staatsräson, because what Staatsräson means is, in this case, to make the security and the identity the reproduction of another state into your own security and identity. And that necessarily means ignoring the Palestinian narrative or Palestinian narrative of 48, Balfour, and so on. Right?
The Nakba, for example. I mean, we had the problem with the Nakba demonstrations for many years.
Yes. So repressing Palestinian nationalism is a logical outcome of Staatsräson. Right? And this basically explains, Staatsräson on the inside. There's Staatsräson on the inside and on the outside. On the outside, it means this kind of support that we were discussing. On the inside, it means stifling pro-Palestinian dissent. In rather extreme terms. Teaching in Hong Kong has turned me into, what Elon Musk says he is, which is a free speech absolutist, right? But honestly, I mean it. I think the fact that in Germany only certain narratives of this conflict are, state-sanctioned, others are not, is wrong. I think it should be completely possible to have opposing perspectives on this conflict, right? In this very naive Habermasian idea of having a public sphere where different narratives can be debated. So I'm still sort of like old school naive on that. But I think my certain experiences of the recent years have led me in that direction. But it's a very sort of like old school liberal point of view. It's very boring.
Talking about rhetoric, maybe very much to ask you, Yeah, I mean, okay, just one more question to you, Pankaj.
Can I just add something? I mean, I find it extremely shocking, since you mentioned Habermas, that the exponent of communicative rationality should now become the main philosophical justifier of Israel's atrocity and attack or deem criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. I cannot think of a more spectacular destruction of a main Western philosophical tradition by someone who almost single-handedly built it himself. What a disgrace! What a disgrace! And I'm surprised that we don't speak enough about this, you know, in public.
He didn't speak a lot about it afterwards.
Well, he hasn't, yeah, but I mean, I think he should have at least qualified some of those initial remarks later on. But no clarification has been forthcoming. And we are now forced to live with this extraordinary statement and to reconsider this extraordinarily distinguished legacy in the light of this statement, which is, you know, truly unfortunate.
Talking about rhetorics and wording and narratives, far-right nationalists in Israel, in Europe, in America, they use the same kind of language that was used by the Nazis in Germany. You're talking about this in the book as well. So Muslims and Arabs are portrayed as alien and indigestible. No, you are using these words, and cannot be integrated because Islam is somehow incompatible with Western culture or Western mindset or society, and they were not being part of European history, which ignores the fact that they have been part of European history for centuries. So what do you make out of this parallel? You know, what does it show very, very clearly, Pankaj? Would you say that, you know, the fact that we are using the same language nowadays, you know, that to a certain extent that Nazis used to use, what does it say about, you know, maybe Germans have never completely overcome their racism and their Nazi thinking, or, you know, what's the difference between West Germany and the DDR here? You know, how is this perpetuating itself?
I would, you know, again would want to sort of take it out of the German realm and see this as a larger problem, a problem that is created by an economic system that is fundamentally dysfunctional, that generates intolerable levels of inequality, and constantly requires scapegoats to be blamed for inequality, for people feeling miserable about their lives. So you can always identify a certain population and blame it and say this minority cannot be accommodated, this minority is parasitic, this minority is conspiring to undermine our society. And of course, you know, the most vicious manifestation of this attitude was starting the late 19th century, culminating in the Holocaust. Now we see a different minority being blamed in precisely the same kind of language, and not just in Europe, but in different other parts of the world. Almost every nation state has a minority that it can blame. So again, we have to take it out of Germany and see this. I mean, obviously, the worst things actually happen. The worst thing happened in Germany. But there are other ways in which this mechanism of scapegoating achieves monstrous, violent effects. And, you know, this is something that is happening in India today, where again a minority is being scapegoated precisely using exactly, and this is so remarkable, so striking, is the same sort of limited ideas are being deployed over and over again. This isn't about overpopulation. You know, these people are too many. They breed too fast. You know, the things that were said about the Jewish population in Europe. Precisely the same things being said about Muslims in India today. So I think what it really shows, and this is what we should be kind of also thinking about, is like, what kind of social and economic system is this that produces these repetitive horrors? Why can't we actually aspire to one where this becomes, you know, impossible? Where justice and a degree of well-being is available to everyone. I mean, you know, this is speaking extremely idealistically, but I'm just trying to say, like, these questions recur because we you know, get bogged down in particular national context, cultural context, but actually don't see that the modern world has been created, been knit together by a rapacious mode of capitalist expansion that constantly needs scapegoats in order to resolve its international contradictions, internal contradictions, its internal problems.
Okay, now let's take this back to Germany, Daniel, then. This is obviously very convincing that it's a systematic a problem of the system, which is a huge question that we won't be able to answer today, but maybe we can get back to this in a moment. But going back to Germany, if this Staatsräson logic leads to the exclusion and humiliation of a certain section of society, then isn't Staatsräson essentially a form of nationalism?
Proxy nationalism, yes.
What's the difference?
The difference is, what Germany does is, partially at least, is to recreate its own nationalism vis-à-vis Israel, right? So it needs Israel to rebuild its own national brand. And that national brand is now becoming a lot less popular globally, also because of this attachment, right? If you think about Staatsräson, what the term means is every state has a Staatsräson, right? It is what a state does to reproduce itself, right? Crush internal dissent, defeat an external army, that kind of thing. So every state has one, only Germany has two, by making the security of Israel into its own Staatsräson, which is, again, an understandable, step, also from the perspective of Angela Merkel in 2008. But what it effectively means is that it strengthens and furthers this proxy type of nationalism, this really weird, negative symbiotic relationship between those two countries, because it goes both ways, right? For Israel, its own nationalism is actually a refusal, of course, of Germany, but it needed Germany to rebuild or to build its state, right? So what you have until today is a really strange symbiosis between these two countries that should not be further apart, but that are extremely tied to one another, like twins that emerged from the horrors of the 20th century. This is what they are, and they are tied at the hip today in this really bizarre relationship that in Germany is constantly misconstrued and celebrated, not understood, right? So what we're doing is we're constantly continuing to misunderstand the relationship, which is in fact fundamental to the reconstruction of this state and of the Jewish state.
And this has strong consequences on authoritarianism and the rise of authoritarian thinking within Germany, because this Staatsräson is then being used as a reference point for different attempts to change and reshape various areas of public life. I look at the different anti-Semitism resolutions that we witnessed, to change politics, law, business, culture, science, universities, through these anti-Semitism resolutions and the implementation of this misinterpreted, I would say, IRA definition. So this fight against anti-Semitism is being abused by parties precisely. It was the AfD that started the first anti-Semitism resolution against BDS back then. So every other party took over to say, well, let's not leave the fight against anti-Semitism to the AfD, let's do it ourselves. And if you look at how they applauded the resolution last October in the Bundestag, this was really shocking, and whoever has not understood until then that this very much plays in this authoritarian playbook of parties like the AfD has not really caught the shots, so understood where we are heading. So how would you say is this,
No, the AfD, as we say, is a party of the 1950s, right? It is also going back to the exchange logic of the 1950s, whitewashing for state building. It is latching onto the very logic that Adenauer himself instituted, right? They are true to the spirit in some way of the Federal Republic of Germany, right? They are not necessarily completely outside of it, they are outside inside. So they're changing things back towards the 1950s in that way as well. And it's not a coincidence that the new right or the far right has discovered the Jewish state as a means to rehabilitate itself. Because what can you do by doing that? It serves at least a double function. You can whitewash your own anti-Semitism, your own Nazism, right? And you can legitimize your anti-Muslim racism. So it's a very elegant way. And that's not of, rehabilitating yourself, constructing yourself as a legitimate political force, now dominant force, everywhere in Europe. Let's not forget that the true neo-Nazis in Germany were very deeply anti-Zionist, right? They hated Israel because it was a Jewish state. The new far right loves it for the reasons I just mentioned.
That's yeah. I mean, what you're saying, Daniel, actually makes me think that it might be quite useful to think about these mechanisms that you're describing, staunchest, and the way it's being deployed, to actually also think about other places where this thing is happening, and it's actually happening in real time as we speak, and in a very speeded up fashion. So I'm thinking of a country that has not formally codified staunchest in quite the same way that Germany has, but is nevertheless as devoted, if not more devoted, to the defense of Israel than Germany is United States, where the bipartisan sort of dedication to the state of Israel, to defending the state of Israel, no matter what it does, right now, again, using anti-Semitism to crack down on dissent, to close down universities, to accumulate enormous amounts of illegitimate state power, to unleash the police in a way that has not been seen before in the United States against defenseless students. So this German process that you're describing is actually, we are witnessing it in real time in the United States. Again, notorious anti-Semites like Elon Musk, using his proximity to Netanyahu to whitewash his anti-Semitism. This is a man who's tweeting or supporting great replacement theorists, and there are various other examples come to mind. So I think you really have to look very closely at these sort of global communities knit together by this allegiance, by this overinvestment in the state of Israel, and to see what are they trying to achieve in their respective national context by this uncritical, unconditional solidarity with the state of Israel.
How about the Jewish community, the international Jewish community? Because there is really a crisis in Judaism and the relationship that different diaspora Jews have towards the state of Israel. How would what dynamic do you see international here?
Christine, I'm not really well qualified to speak on this matter. What I can tell you is what I read in the newspapers and the periodicals that I trust. From what I can see, there's a huge divide in demographic divide in the United States. Less so in other places, but we can be confident that there is a very large, extremely committed, politically active generation of Jewish Americans today who have very extremely different views on the subject compared to their elders, and I think generally positions on this subject, views on this subject, are changing quite rapidly. It seems just from looking at the opinion polls, even amongst kind of general population. But I think looking at just the Jewish American population, I think opinion is changing pretty dramatically.
There is this growing dissent among Jews, internationally, and we have these critical voices here in Germany as well within the Jewish community, but they're not being heard. They are even silenced, they are being excluded, they are being attacked even. Why is that, Daniel? And maybe, obviously the German society very much listens to the official representatives of the State of Israel here and the official representatives of the Jewish community in Germany, and they are by doing so, they are kind of associating Jewish life in Germany with Israel, which is an expression of anti-Semitism in the first place, because to equate Jewish life with the state of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism. So, why is that? It brings us probably back to the Staatsräson, but maybe we find something else. Yeah, because it's dramatic. If you look at how Jews are being treated now when they are demonstrating for international humanitarian law, for example, and against what's happening in Gaza.
But again, it's just an effect of Staatsräson.
Yeah, so
if the idea is that you follow whatever policy is in place in Israel, then you have to exclude all the voices critical of that, right?
Even Jewish voices, yes.
Yeah. And then I wouldn't expect the German government to make Jewish Voice for Peace also the official spokesperson for Jewish life in Germany, because they aren't. We're talking also about very marginal institutions, partially organizations. But yeah, it's an effect of Staatsräson and an effect of limiting speech to a certain prescribed policy line, right? This is a logical effect of that. But there is a spectacle in there, of course, of non-Jewish German politicians telling Jewish Germans what political opinions are legitimate and what aren't, right? I mean, yeah, and well, everyone who's here, right? Basically, and worldwide as well. Yeah, it's true, of course. So that's quite. I mean, that is spectacular. That is extremely strange, and like I don't know how they do that. To be honest, it's weirdly narcissistic and bizarre. Maybe.
I'm just reminded as you were speaking of this notorious quote by Winston Churchill, who, as many of you might know, presided over some of the worst episodes of British imperial rule over India, including a devastating famine in Bengal in the 40s. And at some point he was asked, by one of his colleagues to meet a few Indians to kind of get a different sense of, what they think about this. And he said, I have my own views on India, and I don't want them to be disturbed by any bloody Indians. And that seems to be roughly the attitude here.
Okay. All over the place. Let's talk a little bit about how Israel is perceived elsewhere. We have talked a lot about our perception in Germany of Israel, but for example, in India, in South Africa, to what extent is the perception of Israel and Palestine the result of these countries' own experiences and history? Pankaj.
I think historically, and it's really important to understand this, there was a lot of sympathy for the early Zionists amongst Asian and African leaders in the early 20th century. Why was that? Because European Jews were seen as fellow victims of European racism. And so their aspiration for a homeland was seen as perfectly legitimate. And this is, at different times, people like Sun Yat-sen would say that, or Nehru would say that, or Gandhi would say that. Gandhi, a lot of people don't know this, his closest friends in South Africa were Jewish, and they educated him in Zionism from a very sort of early stage. So he was incredibly well-informed about the subject. So were a lot of major Indian leaders. So that sympathy really persisted for a long time. But then it also became clear to many of them that Israel was increasingly depending and seeking alliances with Western imperialist powers. So they became wary of this. And all through the 1930s, people like Nehru and Gandhi are saying, yes, we are sympathetic to the desire for the Jewish people to have their own homeland, but we don't want them to be creating this homeland on the basis of British arms or using British arms. And this is something we don't approve of. But when Israel is created, it becomes very clear that Israel is really being kind of the main power supporting Israel at that time are Western powers, and of course also, let's not forget, the Soviet Union at the time. But because Israel's creation really is at the expense of the large Arab population that is dispossessed at the same time, attitudes, opinions change dramatically. And Israel is suddenly seen across Asia and Africa as a state that has essentially now become a colonialist state, using Western methods precisely to create a nation state right at the time when decolonization is happening. So, there are these extraordinary collision between two different historical movements. One is the creation of Israel right in the heart of the Middle East, and then, of course, that is precisely the moment India starts to break free, Indonesia starts to break free. The whole process of decolonization happens. So, decolonization proceeds 50s, 60s, 70s, and once Israel becomes more explicitly a colonialist state, the sort of image of Israel is then fixed, really more or less, forever, which is that this is a state that really can only be aggressive and expansionist and continuously rely upon imperialist and neo-imperialist powers to perpetuate itself. And that has really, to this day, I think, it remains, that image has persisted. Now, of course, that image has been blackened by the genocide, because I think for many people who thought decolonization was an established fact, and that it was possible for the colored peoples of the world to live with a degree of dignity, this has come as a huge shock to them. How is this possible? How is this possible that in 2025, 75, 80 years after the process of decolonization began, you can still see white supremacist violence on an extensive scale. You can see a country like Israel inflicting genocidal violence, supported by white supremacist regimes in the United States and elsewhere. And this has come as a huge shock. It's like, what was this history all about of decolonization, if this is still allowed to happen? One reason why, a country like South Africa has risked so much to take Israel to the ICJ. Because, I think many of these countries, many of these societies are in a state of shock. And they do want to, hold on to preserve certain norms, certain laws, certain ideas, deriving from their own struggle against racist imperialism.
Now, going back to the foundation of Israel, you are drawing an interesting comparison with countries like India and Pakistan, when you were talking about certain birth defects of these countries, that they kind of inherited, or they were brought up by the legacy of colonialism. When they were founded, they were all created with some territorial problem here, right? So what is the comparison here, and what does this mean? If these birth defects unresolvable, or how could they be resolved? Or what does it say about the very existence then of these states? How can they cope with this?
In a very sort of
broad... What do you mean maybe by this?
Yeah, birth defects, like, obviously creating a nation state which privileges a homogeneous community in places where you have people of so many different backgrounds, so many different linguistic, ethnic, racial, religious backgrounds living together. I'm talking about the societies of Asia and Africa. They're not really, societies that can be fitted easily into the model of the nation state, which is the European model, and emerges out of a certain European historical experience, but then adopted by different parts of the world, because that seemed like the best way to protect yourself against the incursions of Western imperialism. So they're all really born with birth defects, because they're using institutional forms or a political institution that is actually not suited to the demographic composition of their societies. And so you have, these endless wars in Africa, you have endless civil wars and various secessionist movements, continuous over the last decades. Israel, obviously, you can call it a birth defect, but I think there's another question there, which I hinted in my previous response. When George Orwell, when these discussions about Israel were happening in the 40s, and he said very clearly that Israel is a color issue. Nation states have birth defects, but if the birth defect is compounded by a population that, at least in the beginning, is very clearly of European ancestry, using violence to create a nation state, then there is this other dimension, which is explosive, which is, racism. And I think, again, when it's tied to this larger question of, the struggle against racism, the struggle against racist imperialism, it becomes even more explosive.
But is it possible for these nations to reinvent themselves, to create new narratives for them to become a nation state? This world is organized a nation state. Is it possible, or do you need a certain tradition of coexistence to live together in such a state?
I think the idea of federations the idea about the kind of union that the European Union now consists of. These many ideas were around back in the 30s and 40s, even amongst some of the most nationalistic leaders like Mao Zedong. People were experimenting with these notions back then and saying, actually recognizing that the nation-state model doesn't really fit us. So we need to come up with different ways of sharing sovereignty and different ways of defining sovereignty, national sovereignty. Those ideas can be recovered. I mean, it's interesting to remember that India and Yugoslavia were part of the whole sort of United Nations process, deciding about Israel, and they came up with the idea of a federation, which wasn't agreed to by Western powers. So even in that context, you see that idea at play there. I talk about it in my book, and it's really important to remember that those ideas were floated even in the context of this. So yes, theoretically, of course, the possibility remains open.
Now, you said before that, or you quoted Orwell saying that Palestine is a color issue. So what does this mean for, is this understanding limited to people of color? Obviously not, right? So maybe question to Daniel. Would you agree, or would you say, what does this mean for people in Europe, white Europeans like you and me, for example? Do we come to the same conclusion if this never again is supposed to be, and never again being under colonial rule, never again racism, how are we supposed to deal with this? What does it mean for German society, for this white Germans like you and me?
I mean, I think history can be read by everybody, right? So everybody has a right and the means to inform his or herself about Israel and Palestine and the history of the Middle East, and hence, hopefully, through education, show a less divided sort of solidarity. I hope. I want to go back to another point that you made before and that Pankaj made, which is anti-colonial movements actually seeing a positive example in Israel, right? And it also links back to the German case, because up until 1967, Israel was truly a left-wing issue in Germany. It was the SPD, back when it was a bit more socialist, that unanimously voted in favor of the reparations agreement, right? For moral reasons. It was the dominant conservative, sort of, very Nazi-inflected state apparatus that forged this relationship out of this drive of rehabilitation, right? Which is what Adenauer very openly says in television interviews and in cabinet meetings and so on. So there was this left-wing solidarity that then breaks with 1967, right? And 1967, ironically, is a situation that Germany has contributed to in so many ways, because Germany, along with France, was the main supplier of weapons and support to Israel. The US didn't support Israel very much at all before 67, right? So I would even argue that German responsibility for a two-state solution based on 67 lines is very concrete in the sense of having helped Israel consolidate itself in that region through the 1967 war, right? But it's really after that moment that things break, also when I think anti-colonial expectations run into disappointments everywhere in the post-colonial world, and of course the Suez War, 56, right, is hugely important because Israel then colludes with Great Britain and France to attack Egypt, and this is also sort of like a changing point. So again, I find these decades until 67 truly fascinating. You can find all the history that we discussed today in there, and also all the histories that could have been, that haven't been, right? Yeah.
You were talking about your worries before. You were already mentioning why are you worrying about Germany having this right-wing party on the rise, rearming, this kind of understanding of anti-Semitism. How can we prevent this worrying scenario to happen? What would be your advice, or how can we stop this development? What is exactly preventing German politicians, journalists, public figures from changing their course?
We had a great.
Back to you, Dan.
We had a great leader in India, great leader of the Dalits, B.R. Ambedkar, and his sort of slogan was inform, educate, organize. And I think, as writers and intellectuals with, connections to political activists, thinkers, that's what we can do. We don't actually hold any other kind of power, but we have the potential, the capacity to come up with narratives that are useful in warding off this sort of evil scenario.
The information is all here.
Well,
I mean, it's not here, it's there. You have to look for it. That's the problem.
It's a difficult process.
Okay.
it's a difficult.
Please go ahead.
The fact that, it's taking me so long to have a conversation like this, for instance, several months. And so the obstacles before us are great. There's no question about this. But I think, we must maintain our faith in, just these simple things like reading, writing, thinking, coming together, asking questions, having discussions, because, this crazy momentum that political events have right now, obviously we can't stop it right now, but we can certainly prepare a generation of people who will be in power and in 5, 10 years, 15, 20 years time, who come into these positions of power and influence with a different kind of narrative, with a broader understanding of the stakes, a broader understanding of these histories that we're talking about here. Because, I find the absence of a global history, for instance, really crippling. For all of us to be confined to, national citizenship, nationalistic educational syllabuses, provincial, parochial, journalistic cultures, it's profoundly, profoundly crippling, and it's really paralyzing our political and moral imaginations. And I think we need to break out of this. We need to make a concerted attempt of the kind that organizers this evening have made, to break out of those silos.
I want to explain maybe something to you as an outsider, not having been to Germany during the last 19 months, because the fact that the majority of Germans do not officially condemn the atrocities in Gaza does not mean that they agree what their government is doing, because polls show that 70% of the Germans are actually against weapon exports to Israel. So this is important here to understand the gap, because there's really a gap. There are several gaps actually in Germany, a gap between politicians and citizens, a gap within the society, and a gap between what is openly said and secretly thought. And this affects a lot of people who are employed state employees or in any kind of media institutions. And in some cases, I would even argue that this feels like schizophrenia, a state of mind that can lead to a certain mental illness, because, and I think this is the reason why people would turn away. They would say, okay, leave me alone with Gaza, because they don't want to have anything to do with this, because deep down they feel that they are failing somehow. They are letting the Palestinians down. And they hide behind these arguments like, I don't know enough about this conflict. It's so complicated. Daniel, what would you say about this gap? Because we know all these politicians and journalists, who say something, and then when the microphone goes off, they say something different. So this is a psycho kind of thing.
I mean, politics is a theater production anyhow,
but,
right?
Yeah, but not only.
Yes, yes. I was wondering though, Christine, isn't Gaza depicted as some sort of like faraway event that is very sad and that we have a certain position on but are not involved in? But that's my question, because Germany is of course deeply involved, but it's the second largest supplier of weapons to Israel during this war. It's a crucial diplomatic and moral backer, but who in Germany actually knows this? And who in Germany knows about the history of relations and the history of support? Is because you and I live in certain bubbles where people read those books, but not everybody does, right? So that's also a question of knowledge. And this is where I would go back to what you said, Pankaj, which is, well, reading and writing, which is, also what, we do for a living in different ways. That's crucial, right? So information, I think, comes first in a context that is so hyper-ideological.
Now, last question, and then we're opening this up for the audience. How do we want to, you just mentioned this, okay, informing yourself, but how do you, a lot of people in this room probably are confronted with these kind of discussions within the family, at work, how can we liberate ourselves from the self-imposed censorship somehow? How can we make this difference? What ways do we have to resist maybe somehow? Maybe it's the time to really like make yourself sitting straight and say, you know, at work, for example, you start to, I don't know, what is your, you already said something about this, but maybe you have some more ideas about, you know, the idea of resisting a certain narrative and where could you start, how to build alliances, how to build networks.
I would, you know, first of all, underline the sheer dangerousness of what we are talking about here, of the inability to speak out, the inability to reckon, to face up to the truth, to turn away, to ignore, to be indifferent, which is, you know, the option most people take. I want to remind everyone here that these are precisely the attitudes the most eloquent, the most intelligent survivors of the Holocaust pointed to as main factors in the Holocaust, which is the desire to not rock the boat, the desire to conform, the craving for social promotion, for career advancement. That's a conclusion arrived at independently by Primo Levi and also the most distinguished scholar of the Holocaust, Christopher Browning. So we are, you know, in a way, again confronted with this moral cowardice, with this systematic docility, these habits of obedience and conformity that any number of, you know, writers from Adorno to Hannah Arendt previously remarked upon, deplored, lamented. And yet, again, we don't seem to obviously learn from those critiques or analysis. But I would say, if you're not speaking out now, when are you going to speak out? If you're not going to take risks now, if you with a platform, with some kind of access to the public at large, whether it's even on social media, even if you're not a well-known writer or academic or thinker, to not speak up about this, I think you're becoming part of a sort of slaughter machine, I think is what I would call it.
Thank you, Pankaj. So talking about speaking out, you are all invited now to speak out. No, you're not invited to speak out and make large, long comments. You are invited to ask very short and precise questions because we have so many people here. We want to somehow maximize the time by allowing as many questions as possible. So please be short. Think about the most important question you have. We will collect several of them in different parts of this room, so people sitting next to each other will we will collect these questions and give them back to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for your thoughts. It's super revealing and enlightening. I'm wondering, you know, an entire generation of like people in Germany, like especially younger people, have witnessed what happened over the past 1.5 years. Basically, Germany being complicit in genocide in the name of memory culture. And you know, if I understand your thesis correctly, it's that Staatsräson in a way is like irredeemable, and that the state is not like a reliable actor to foster memory culture. And so I'm wondering what would be like a better way to sort of like do that apart from the state. Do you have any sort of ideas what would be like a future way to sort of foster memory culture that is maybe a grassroots organ, or is there something that like really resonated with you? That's one question. And the other one, just since you mentioned Habermas, I was wondering, the issue of singularity is so present in these discussions, especially in Germany. Like whenever someone is speaking of a genocide and puts them in a continuity of history, often like the kind of implicit sort of argument leveled against that argument is that this will be an equation. And we saw this a lot like with discussions about like colonialism and like Germany's genocide in, say, Namibia and other places, that like whenever people made those arguments, they were like charged with the charge of relativization. So I'm wondering, what's your thoughts on like the issue of like singularity and like instrumentalization of singularity to deflect responsibility?
Yeah, from my side also, many thanks for this very inspiring speech. I have just one comment regarding the aspect of Zionism. I think it was not mentioned during your speech, and I heard some remarks regarding the first Israeli politician like Ben-Gurion. They are classified as to be left. I doubt that this could be the right statement. If we look about the history of Zionism, and especially in 1933 when the Nazi regime came to power, I can remember in the biography of Vladimir Jabotinsky at that time, he was celebrating that the German, as a national society, become to power, because this is his ideology, his idea from the Zionism to become a pure national state in Palestine. And this is what Ben-Gurion was doing. I think during 1947 and 1948, his big plan, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian, he was doing that before the independence struggle in 15 of May 1948. It started in December 1947 until May 1948, where 300,000 Palestinians were expelled from Palestine. And I think, I will come to the end, just to finish. What I mentioned, that the big problem with the Israeli society now is nationalism, that's right, and there's a parallel to Moody ideology. It is based on racism from the beginning. And during the 1970s, we can remember the resolution from the UN, which was saying that Zionism is some kind of racism, and this was taken out during the Oslo Agreement in 1993. Thank you.
So this was more of a comment. We have one more question here in front.
Thank you very much for this beautiful book, and for also I read your book, Pankaj, The World After Gaza, and I have a question concerning. You speak about political imagination, and I would be interested to hear you a little bit more about the kind of solution you are thinking of course, stopping the war and the massacre, but after that.
Okay. We'll take one more question on this side, please.
Thank you, and thank you for a very fruitful discussion. I'd like to pick up the Habermasian beten, though, which means I'd like to challenge you publicly here on one thing that really bugged me. Although there were a couple of things that I didn't agree with, but you know, that's normal, I guess. And that it bugs me because I don't get it at all, and that is the point that you referred to several times of German rearmament, as you said, that's going on at the moment. Which is already a term that I find flawed, because Germany had been disarmed in the past couple of years. However, what I want to get is that you point out some sort of a cognitive discrepancy in Germany, but the case for German rearmament, as you said, doesn't have anything to do with the Middle East or Israel or Gaza, I would say, but with Russia. And you haven't mentioned that once, and I'd like to know why.
Okay, thank you. So, yes, yeah. So the first question was here by Hanno, asking about whether there were better way to organize memory culture, some concrete ideas.
I think Daniel would be probably more qualified to answer that. I think the second question you had about
you have to get it. Yes, the question of comparing and making equation. Equation and comparison.
Yeah, I think, that's a sort of, I've encountered this almost invariably as a bad faith argument, which is the tactic there is to delegitimate you and to kind of expose you as some sort of a, ill-informed, perhaps even an anti-Semite in hiding, who doesn't really understand the true scale of the evil that was perpetrated against the Jewish population, and ignorantly or maliciously wants to compare the Holocaust to other things. Because I say this because I say it very clearly in my book that the Holocaust was a unique event in that, a state, a modern nation state, not only managed to conceive and plan a plan of, this program of mass extermination, but actually achieved it. That they actually managed to kill most of the Jewish population of Europe. I think no previous atrocities come close in that regard. At the same time, as people were pointing out very early on, Hannah Arendt being one of the earliest, the Holocaust does actually have a genealogy. There is, it's not something that erupts and has no connections with anything that happened in the colonies, a certain kind of racist rhetoric, a rhetoric of dehumanization. This was, and not to mention Adolf Hitler's very explicit plans to do in Europe what the British were doing in India. How many of you are aware of that? I mean, how obsessed he was with British dominance over India and British racist practices. He thought the British were too soft on that subject. He was going to be tougher. So once you look at these resemblances, once you look at these inspirations, you cannot see the Holocaust as some uniquely German event. It has a very long and complicated history. Again, I find the German debate is confined to can we draw a line between what the Germans did in Africa to the Holocaust? Again, let's take it out of there. Let's just see what are the things that are inspiring. The Nazis, they're being inspired by American experiments in eugenics. Like what are the intellectual global currents here that are informing Nazi thinking about all this? And that's when you actually see the global history, the true global history of the Holocaust. To say that, is that relativizing it? What nonsense! But it's this is something you hear again and again, and I'm inclined to treat it with mostly with contempt.
Maybe you want to say something about this, or maybe Daniel. Yes, you go first.
Because we're doing answers. Is our mic at fault? Yeah, to Hannu's question, I think necessarily national memory and state power, they hang together, right? One sort of conditions the other. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. You can build good states, right? But I'm not sure if we're there yet in Germany at the moment. If you look at German sort of like more societal memory culture, the Stolpersteine, for example, they emerged out of a societal agenda. So I think this differentiation just has to be borne in mind. But as long as you have nation states, you will have national memory, you will have nationalism, and those are constantly reconstructed, right? And I think we're currently witnessing a fairly crucial reconstruction of that in Germany, and it's going to be very interesting to look at this in the near future as sort of like the West is integrating somewhat. Russia, as was mentioned, is right now a hostile power in Europe. China is rising. All of that stuff means that necessarily German memory culture, German nationalism will also change. In what directions we can't predict, but currently it's not looking fantastic. Right? I think that was the main question directed.
There's one question about the rearmament of Germany. Maybe you can both.
But I think you were.
Yes, Pankaj has. And then there was this question by Cedric here that. If this is about stopping the war in Gaza, but then after that, what? With your.
I'm sort of puzzled by that question because I think we are looking at a government that is actually, at this point, actively supporting a genocide, cracking down on people who protest against it brutally, and at the same time is raising a perception, encouraging the perception that you have Vladimir Putin in Russia about to invade Europe, and therefore we need to rearm. And this is not, by the way, it's not an argument that is being made only in Germany, it's also being made in the United Kingdom. And again, I think in this case, let's confine ourselves to Germany. When people rearm, I don't want to constantly harp on this question, but I think there was another time when Germany was disarmed and then it started to rearm again. It wasn't actually saying that this is what we want to do. They obviously gave some other reason for rearming, but was a highly dangerous move in those circumstances. Everyone realized at the time and pointed it out. So if you have far-right surging in a country, becoming, in some opinion polls, the most popular party, if you have a state that is complicit, a political class, a media class complicit in genocide, in that context, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia on the rise, you decide to rearm, how can that not be a disturbing and a sinister move? I hope you understand my bafflement. We can discuss more of this later. Oh, the solution question again. I think again, it's really extremely hard to offer any kind of precise solutions to such large, daunting, interlocking set of problems, because, as a writer, as an intellectual, you feel simply dwarfed by them, and I think even the task of diagnosing them clearly is overwhelming. But I think the act of trying to identify clearly what those problems are, I feel in a way they themselves should open up sufficient scope for our moral imaginations to be working slightly less effectively. Once we actually look at the problems, we can perhaps see, more clearly what the solutions might be.
On. Sorry, this is very odd. 3 questions over there.
Okay. Hello, thank you very much for your fantastic analysis of how Israel plays a role in the political imaginary of the US and Germany as white supremacist governmentalities, right? To create nationalist or even authoritarian states. One thing that I've been asking myself in the last 2 years in all these discussions, though, is that is there a possibility that Israel plays also not only a role as a political imaginary, but also a role in the political economy of the states? Because they're supporting a genocide. How much of your memory culture is so important to you to support a genocide? So my question simply to you is, we have been discussing these things from a materialistic approach in the 70s. We don't anymore. Why? Is it secondary? Is the political economy, like the role that Israel plays economically, secondary? Don't we need to discuss it, or why don't we discuss it? I don't have an answer.
Thank you for this precise question. There's another one. Heidi is moving the mic.
Thank you also for the wonderful discussion. I was very pleased by your emphasis on the importance of a global historical approach. I'm personally actually a student of global history, and I'm also very convinced of the merits of global history. But I'm also puzzled right now at the state of paralysis that we are observing from the global south, that we don't see any kind of, on the state level, diplomatic attempts, concerted diplomatic attempts from the side of the global south to challenge the current what is everything that's going on. I more or less posed the same question in the last panel, which was in German, and I didn't find the answer of the participant very convincing. But as a student of global history, I'm puzzled that in the 1970s, as the previous person mentioned, we had this momentum of the anti-colonial movements, the different state leaders from the global south, posing real diplomatic challenges to the north, but now the only states that are actually formulating political resistance to Israel are more or less Spain, as you mentioned, or Ireland, or Norway. I find that quite disappointing from the perspective of a person from the global south.
Thank you very much. One last.
Thank you very much for the debate. I think Christine Hellberg asked a very important question. Who are the main supporters of Israel? And I think initially it wasn't answered clearly, and I think it's very important to state that. It's the United States, it's Germany, it's the United Kingdom. Maybe the assumption is that everybody knows it, but outside there are some young people, they might not know it. And also in the European Union, Czech Republic, Hungary. But I think the most important thing, I mean, we are in Germany, but the main supporter of Israel is the United States. And we are talking about vetoes in the Security Council, I think more than 50 vetoes since the 1970s. And we are talking about an endless, I mean, it's important to criticize German arms supplies to Israel, but they are ridiculously small compared to the one, yes, they are. The United States, Joe Biden supplied 14,000 2,000-pound bombs to Israel in the first 9 months since 7th October. And Donald Trump is going to supply another 35,000 2,000-pound bombs. So I think it's very important to talk about the role of the United States, and then you can talk about the transatlantic relation in Germany, and the transatlantic relation is almost like a religion, almost like Staatsräson. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will answer these 3 questions here. Who wants to go first on the... I mean, there was one question about the materialistic approach, the political economy. Pankaj, do you want to start with this?
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you for your question. It's an intriguing fact that the early sort of materialist analysis have been replaced, and I think, I mean, we should not ignore them, because the support for Israel, and the gentleman back there is right in one respect, that the majority support does come from the United States, and it's multidimensional. It's obviously, there's a great deal of emotional investment in the state of Israel. There's a lot of political investment, but there's also, very importantly, the Silicon Valley connection with the tech industry. And that hasn't been sufficiently examined. I certainly agree with you there. But I think, what has really, in a way, perhaps replaced the materialist analysis is the identification with or affiliation with Israel in countries which don't really have that many economic investments in Israel. And I suppose if you're living in the age of the sort of global far-right resurgence, then obviously our attention is kind of focused on these far-right formations and these questions like, why are they doing it? They don't actually have any material interests in the state of Israel. And the material interests are limited to thinking, oh, let's get on this pro-Israel gravy train. If you're, for instance, a Spanish politician, the far right, like Abascal of Vox in Spain, you basically want to be part of this because it'll get you invited to conferences in America, and you'll hang out with other far rightists and the people, the very rich people who fund these outfits and networks, and get a little bit of money for yourself. So those are the sort of, it's not so much the investment in Israel, but it's like moving in these pro-Israel lobbies can bring you material benefits. But you're right, I mean, I think that aspect should be explored more closely. The way in which tech industries, for instance, have forged this relationship with Israel, and that makes for a certain kind of solid political consensus.
How about the paralysis in the global south? Maybe you can answer to that.
I think, it's again something really worth exploring because, and it leads you to some, unfortunately, depressing conclusions. Palestine back in the 60s and 70s, I think Palestinian nationalism both as a political movement, as an intellectual movement, really starts to become truly international and global from the late 60s onwards. That's when it starts to attract people like Edward Said and various other writers, poets, not just Palestinian or Arab, but people in India, people in Pakistan, people in Malaysia, people in Indonesia. And so Palestine as a cause, I remember growing up in India, Palestinian students all around us, Palestinian rallies, the government speaking up for the Palestinians, Palestinian leaders coming to India all the time. And again, for someone like Nelson Mandela in South Africa, he said very famously, like, the liberation of South Africa is not complete without the liberation of Palestine. So Palestine in many ways was sort of center stage. Of course, what has happened since then, 3 decades of, these new networks, new kind of connections being forged, ruling classes, the global south, becoming closer and closer to the plutocratic classes of Europe and the United States. So some of these more principled commitments to, for instance, the Palestinian cause, have been diluted, have been undermined. And you see this very clearly in the case of India, where Indian businessmen, Indian politicians want to do these deals with Israel, with the state of Israel. So they've completely abandoned their kind of older commitments. Also, as I said, they are emotionally and ideologically very close to this far-right regime in Israel. Having said that, I would still say that South Africa, in the end, did not fully abandon the Palestinian cause. It did take an enormous risk in going to the ICJ, and right now is being punished by the United States, being humiliated. And
you mean because of the transfer of white settlers?
Absolutely.
Yes,
can
you maybe
and now you have
this?
this farce, this spectacle of these white South Africans who are incredibly privileged people in South Africa being received in the United States. I'm sure you saw these ridiculous images a couple of days ago. So I think there is still a great degree of commitment in certain countries. Malaysia is another example. The Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has been extremely vocal, one of the more vocal international leaders. Pope Francis, I would say, he was not that he's, in some sense, he's from the global south. He was from the global south, and he was, extremely eloquent on this subject. Indonesia has been. So there are instances where I think, people have rallied, politicians, journalists have spoken out. But on the whole, I would agree that, that cause in the global south has not been taken up in the way it used to be. And I think it also has to do with the fact, we must confront it, that Palestinian leadership is fragmented. It's now, what remains of the Palestinian Authority is thoroughly discredited. So it cannot command any kind of intellectual or moral power. You don't have intellectuals, respectable intellectuals, associating themselves with a corrupt regime in the West Bank. And obviously, for various reasons, there won't be any kind of affiliation with the people who run Gaza, or people who ran Gaza. So, there are also like real problems in kind of organizing solidarity around the Palestinian cause. So for that reason, most of the recent attempts to organize those solidarities have been confined to the global north, to European and American campuses primarily. And that's a really interesting fact that we should reflect more on why that has happened.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very important point, talking about the Palestinian leadership and the lack of credible figures for other politicians in the global south to identify with. Maybe, Daniel, one sentence on the transatlantic relation between US playing this major role in the future.
Historically, of course.
The future, it was about the future.
The future, I don't know.
Okay. Thanks for being that short.
It's difficult to predict. Yeah. I wanted to say about this global south solidarity thing, I find it very interesting because sort of like naturally you would expect that the global south rises up in favor of the Palestinians. It's not at all the case, right? Even in the Middle East, places like Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, they are more looking towards Asia, right? They are looking into, places where history is moving ahead, where things are being made. And the Palestine issue is sort of like an old conflict, it's an old sort of like issue for anti-colonial leaders. It's territorial, and it seems so old school, right? Which is now being picked up then on American university campuses more than it is, in politically active circles in many global south places, even in the Middle East, right? And this also means because you mentioned the reputational aspect of, the German position, many global south countries will continue to do business with Germany if they can, right? The only reason that they will move elsewhere is because, China, right? But not because of Palestine. And this, I think, just needs to be acknowledged, right? And I think you put that very well.
Talking about political economy again. So we are collecting, 3 more questions over there. Short question.
Yes, short question. Thanks a lot for this discussion. Just 2 points I wanted to make. I think it's probably better to not use words like birth defects and crippling in these discourses. It's very ableist. I'm sorry to bring that up. I wanted to just comment on your point, Pankaj, that you made about sort of how Hindu nationalism was fascinated with Israeli nationalism. And you said that sort of the secularism or like social liberalism held them back from being real men. And I think this is an interesting point to think about how ethno-nationalism and kind of patriarchal structures tend to go hand in hand, and how I think discourse really needs to be truly sort of intersectional in this sort of feminist intersectional way. And I'm just curious because it hasn't come up yet tonight in the discussion at all, so I'd be curious just to hear.
Hi, thank you very much also from my side. I have 2 little points. One is a question regarding how is it possible that this is, Christine said earlier that we are a little like schizophrenic or I feel so it has been said by the highest official members of the Israeli army, people of the government, what their intentional plan is, and yet the German media and the German outlets, news outlets, are constantly ignoring the statements that they actually did themselves, what their real intentions are. And the last and second point was, the Stolpersteine were not created as memory culture in a good way, commemorating for the Jewish, the murdering of the Jewish people. The memory in the Stolpersteine were creation as a protest of the deportation of the Romani people, who were supposed to be deported when Yugoslavia broke down in Germany. Deported all the Roma people who sought refuge here.
Thank you very much for this information and the 2 comments.
Yeah, thank you also for me. I have a question that you have already touched upon, but I would be happy if you could dive into it a little bit more, which is the gap that Christine mentioned between politics or official public sphere on the one side and the population and how the population deals here in Germany with it. I'm asking that against the background of that we know that the memory culture in Germany is very much dominated by the memory politics, by the official politics. It's institutionalized, or was institutionalized throughout the 70s, 80s, and so on. So all the events that we have, the memorialized, like the statues, not statues, but the memorials, thanks, that we have, it's a very official memory culture, right? At the same time, families, like German families, including my own, haven't dove into the biography, their complicity of their family on a very personal and family level. So we have that on the one side, that memory culture is a very official project, and on a societal level, we don't have this memory culture in this intensity that it has on the official side. On the other hand, Christine was saying that there's a much more or a bigger resistance or a disapproval of what's going on in Palestine. So I was wondering somehow if you could dive into more in like this dynamic, like what dynamics do you see there between like the official politics and the societal level when it comes to memory culture in Germany or also somewhere else? And yeah, what developments do you observe there?
We take one more question and then we give it back.
Yeah, because...
Yeah, I mean, I will repeat the questions. Okay. Just one more question, because one was more of a statement.
I want to bring another aspect or question inside this. Mr. Mishra, you said Palestine is a color question. I do not agree. I see something completely other here. I see that Israel and other countries, they have the might to do something, and so they do it. And I see this question because before, when there is a counterpart, for example, the Soviet Union, so you can't do that what you really want. You have not the might, because you always you have to justify yourself, and so the West got up to say, oh, we are the best, we have humanity and these things and this. And I think the question of Palestine also in Germany is this: we see now we begin to be the good ones, and now we want to have might, political might, go up in the share of the Americans and the other people. I think this is all a question of might, and Israel now, it have the might to crush, to kill the Palestinians, and they do it, and the Americans do it also. And what me disturbs so much, what Mr. Mavitzky said, that the Arab countries, the Gulf countries, it's their own Arab people. It's their own people. And they are not able to protect them, and they don't want. If I see Trump when he did his economic forum, how they flattered him and he flattered them. And they don't speak about Palestinians. For me, it's only question of might. If you can kill, you kill. And if you have the might, you make all what you want.
Okay, thank you very much. Pankaj, maybe you can start with this. Is this more a question of might than of color? And maybe you could answer the question about the intersectional perspective, patriarchal structures behind that we haven't mentioned yet.
Yeah, it was not me who, it was George Orwell who said that at a particular time about the color issue, about Palestine being a color issue. What he meant was that in the United Nations, the line was very clearly divided. The countries of Asia and Africa were voting against the partition of Palestine. And he could see very clearly that the old racist imperialists on one side and the people fighting against them were opposed to this partition. So it was a color issue back then, but I think for many people who have built their identity, national identity, and in some cases individual identity, on this successful battle against racist imperialism, Israel becomes a color question again, because it reminds them that battle clearly was not won. So if racist imperialism was something that they all felt as a kind of great atrocity, and said to themselves, never again, well, here it is, back again. And so that is, again, that makes it the color question. You're right about, of course, the rule of might. I mean, that's what we're looking at. It's the assertion of might, the idea that might makes right, and the powerful make their own rules, or they do without rules. And the weak are going to be killed, they're going to be persecuted, they're going to be crushed. There's going to be no mercy for them, and that's the sort of global Buddha. That's why I keep saying it's a very dangerous moment when democratically elected governments start to support or to become complicit in these structures and mentalities. You're absolutely right about that. Question about hypermasculinity. I think it's a hugely important subject, and I've tried to write about it in my book because Hindu nationalism was from the very beginning a quest for a hypermasculinist identity. The British had stigmatized Hindus as an inferior people who were weak, who were cowardly, who were, in other words, feminine. They had created these sort of gender binaries, privileging masculinity over femininity, and they identified Hindus with femininity and said these are inferior people whose destiny it is to be ruled by the real men. And the first generation of nationalists who encountered this rhetoric, their response was in many ways to internalize that critique and then to say that, look, we are going to make ourselves as manly as you are. So instead of challenging this particular binary that the British had created, they accepted it, they internalized it. So nationalism for them became a quest for hypermasculinity. And likewise with many of the early Zionist leaders, they were also exercised by this allegation, by this accusation, that the Jews are a cowardly people. They are extremely weak and not really people who can fight in a war. And I think many Zionists sort of internalizing this critique set out to show that we can be as hardy, as masculine as the other European people. So there is a kind of, again, there's a sort of, emotional affinity between these mentalities of Hindu nationalism and Zionism right from the beginning. And, when I was talking about growing up with people projecting that was kind of projection out of this perceived state of weakness. Like, we are extremely weak right now, but here are these real men who can get away with, whatever they wish to do. So there was such envious admiration of real men that was informing this kind of political affiliation. So I think you're absolutely right. We have to be really super aware of the gender politics involved in all of this, and how that sort of played out, and not just in the sort of public realm and the political realm, but in domestic lives, in personal lives.
Thank you very much for that dimension. Maybe Daniel, you want to answer the question about the memory culture and the question about the official, the institutionalized kind of memory culture. This will be precisely what we will be discussing next week. How to get from this kind of kind of institutionalized memory culture that is put onto German society to a more self-made memory.
I very much like that point about reproducing the sort of domination that you're up against, right? I think this is a basic trait of anti-colonialism, that you have to reproduce that which oppresses you to become free, right? And this reproduces, of course, these structures. And hyper-masculinity, warlike masculinity, that's very much part of that, right? And this is what, those very Prussian or post-Nazi observers in the Eichmann trial, for example, observed when they saw Israel. They were like, okay, these are now real men. They can fight. Fantastic. Now we're friends, right? So this is also So it's part of that, of that pattern of reproduction. Memory culture, I completely agree. It's so bizarre that in German families, majorities think that their grandparents or great-grandparents were resistors, or at the very least, silently against. It's mathematically not possible, right? But it's shown in study after study. And unless you address that problem, you will not have, a working memory culture. Because this kind of memory culture, it cannot be imposed from the state, right? I mean, this has to come from the bottom up, and in a bourgeois society, that means, the family unit. This is where you have to start. So I completely agree. This would be if I will ever become I don't know, Minister of Education or something in Germany. This
Let's
is something.
go.
He said regeneration, so I'm going to wait 10, 15 years. Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up that question.
We're collecting the last round of questions. Heike, hello. Yes, 3 more questions, right? In the front.
I have
this
two
is the last round. Thank you for your patience.
I have 2 questions. One question, okay. We've been talking a lot about this, that's Israel is like an extension of Europe. And my question about the objectivization or objectivation of Jewish and Jewish life in Germany. How you see this topic from the perspective of projecting specific, like if you talk about Orientalism and we kind of talk about Israelism or Jewishism, like this kind of, or a very, very objectified image of Jews and being the savior or the one who can speak in behalf of the victims, so to speak.
Thank you.
So I think my question is a good sort of follow-on from yours, and a good one for the future Minister of Education here. And it's a question to German allies. It's a question in particular to white Germans who carry the legacy of the perpetrator class. And it's a question about whether you could comment, Daniel, on what kind of language or discourse we might imagine as a way to wake white Germany up to the fact that many of these mechanisms which are designed to project an image of Germany being a post-anti-Semitic culture in fact amount to inverted anti-Semitism. So I like to speak about the German sandwich. When it comes to progressive Jews in this country, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, in the sense that from the perspective of those who are in positions of authority, the political class, the media class, progressive Jewish opinions are to be silenced. In fact, this is a condition of Staatsräson. Staatsräson cannot be plausible in the presence of Jewish diversity. And so in order to preserve Staatsräson, progressive Jewish opinion must be disciplined and muted and silenced on the one hand. On the other hand, within civil Germany, people who, according to polls, see things differently and are more sympathetic to the Palestinian plight, progressive Jews are told all the time by white Germans that we as white Germans can't speak up. It's not our place. We rely on you as Jews to lead the way. And so there's an implicit sort of pushing of progressive Jews into the front line because you can speak about these things and we as Germans don't have the right to speak about them. And so when I speak about a German sandwich, I speak about the double expectation from the top that progressive Jews will shut the fuck up, and from the bottom that progressive Jews will march in the front line almost to protect white Germans from their worst instincts. And so how does one, because I really don't think this should be the work of Jewish people, how does one as a white German who feels a true and sincere responsibility both to the past and the present of this country determine the terms of the language at the dinner table, in more discursive contexts, whereby there can slowly be an understanding of the fact that both of these pressures, whether it's from top down or bottom up, essentially put progressive Jews in the position of fixing Germany's problems, either by shutting up or by jumping into the fire and leading the discourse.
Okay, this was directly to you, Daniel. Maybe you need more time to think about it, so Pankaj maybe can go first. And so the question about this, making this parallel with Orientalism and Israelism, Jewishism, the objectivation of the Jews.
I think, Daniel is definitely more qualified to answer that question. Maybe I can offer a modest proposal to take away the right from Germany to interpret its own crimes and monopolize them. Monopolize our interpretation. Because the rest of the world is fed up. It really is. The right to interpret and then to impose their interpretation brutally on people who disagree from it. what impunity, what extraordinary impunity. You know, this is how it looks when you look at it from the outside. But you'll probably be able to answer that.
I'm not sure at all. I think that Israelis, Palestinians, Jewish people in Germany are simply not responsible for solving Germany's memory questions, right? It's a non-Jewish German job to do that. And this links back to the question of family and family memory, right? This is where it starts. So I do think that your historical positionality, of course, impacts your thinking, but your questioning has to start with yourself, right? And this is why I'm just not a great fan of this type of identity politics that uses the other, be it Jews, be it Muslims, whatever, to basically solve your own political problems, right? And this links back to this sort of like memory theater that the sociologist, I think Bodemann, right, wrote about, that Max Stoic then used in the book. It's true. Like, I mean, the one who is directing this theater, that's the German state, and sort of like post-Nazi Germans, right? So yeah, maybe take that job away, become the director. I don't know.
There's one other thing that might be useful in eliminating this pathology, which is, right now in India, there's a very concerted attempt by the Hindu nationalist government to create a memory culture closely mimicking that of both Germany and Israel. So they're creating a memory culture around the partition of India. The partition of India was a hugely ambiguous event. It was not an act of mass extermination by a modern nation state, organized, executed in a bureaucratic fashion. It was an eruption of horrific violence. And there were some episodes of organized violence here and there, but it was really a civil war. And really, people are still kind of grappling and trying to understand it, but using very different tools and techniques to understand it. It's not comparable to the Holocaust, but what the current government has realized that you can build or you can renovate your national identity by deploying a certain narrative of victimhood. So you present Hindus as the primary victims of the partition, and Hindu women in particular, again bringing again the intersectional question, depict them as victims of Muslim rapists, and sort of create this sort of vision of the defiled, the violated Indian nation. And that is extremely potent, extremely powerful. And so there's now an attempt to create a museum, to have commemoration days, where we all sort of observe the victimization of Hindus. So I think what it tells you about memory cultures is that memory cultures are deliberately cultivated by state actors. And they don't actually have a spontaneous or organic relationship with the events that they refer to. That these are often, there's a gap of decades before those events and the construction of memory culture. It's very clear in the case of both Germany, United States, Israel, that the Holocaust, there was a very different understanding of it, very different place in it in the national cultures, that only decades later that these countries started to create these memory cultures out of perceived ideological needs. And I feel like this whole question has not been historicized enough. So I think we need to look more closely at the 1970s and 80s and identify other factors that were at work there, helping these narratives emerge. Because it's a very important question to ask. Why did they emerge so late? When so many survivors were actually dead or dying, why wasn't this memory culture there in the first instance? What was the need for it in the 70s and 80s? Really important. And then if you ask those questions correctly, then you'll have to kind of look at very many different factors, secularization, the loss of national sovereignty, the loss of legitimacy on the part of many ruling classes, economic crises, the need for a new national narrative. All these things will then come into play, but I think we haven't historicized memory cultures. Right? I mean, this book is probably the first sort of attempt to look at it, in a really broad kind of historical context, but we need more efforts.
Thank you very much. I think what became very clear is to get Germany out of the state of delusion and being paralyzed, we really need to reinvent German memory culture. So I'm happy that we will be discussing this next week. Next Friday, May 23rd, we will talk about a more multi-perspective and a new German memory culture in German with Wolfgang Benz, Asal Dardan, Sarah El-Boulesi, Gerhard Hanloser. Everything else you can follow on Instagram under Zeit zu Reden. Pankaj and, yes, Pankaj, I was about to say this, Daniel and Pankaj will be outside signing their books. I want to thank very much both my panelists and you the audience, for listening, for thinking, for discussing. Many thanks to the SPOR again for making this all possible. Have a nice evening. Thank you.